Tim Cook isn't going to be at Apple forever. He's had an amazing run, full of tons of success between the AirPods, the Apple Watch, AirTags, the transition of the Mac to Apple Silicon, but I'm sure he wants to go out with a bang. Everything he's focused on has been more accessory focused. Nothing really with its own operating system, independent from any other Apple product. Nothing really that radically changes the way we use our computers. And I believe Tim genuinely wants to be a part of something major, something that he'll be remembered for, something for his legacy to go down with. And there's been lots of hero projects, or moonshot projects as many call it, rumored through various sources as well as Apple's patents. That could include folding phones, which are kind of a hybrid between the iPad and the iPhone, turning it into more of a two-in-one product that maybe would make a few headlines, but would it drastically change the way we use our computers at the end of the day? Probably not so much. And also, Tim has to consider what technology Apple can bring to a form factor to make it unique and make it different from everybody else's. And the truth is, folding phones or folding tablets, no matter how innovative or as cool as they may be, Apple would pretty much be at the mercy of whatever displays Samsung provided to them. So Apple's own unique twist can't really bring much to the table. And of course, we've heard lots of discussion about Apple behind the scenes working on some kind of car project. There's been Project Titan and various patents, as well as poached employees from Tesla and other automotive brands. But Apple's likely looking at the EV industry, realizing that the margins are very, very slim. It's near impossible to turn a profit on a car. And Apple pretty much never likes to manufacture their own hardware. And pretty much the only companies that are able to turn a profit in automotive are the ones who are manufacturing themselves. And because Apple likely feels late to the game and like they can't really offer anything to the EV industry that hasn't already been thought of, they likely see not too many advantages to entering the car market themselves, because their expertise is mostly in the design and software performance of their phones, laptops, and tablets. But then enter the mixed reality headset space. It's been around for a while, but what is it lacking? It's lacking true immersion. It's lacking decent pass-through. It doesn't quite have the performance per watt that it needs to go mainstream. And that's one of Apple's greatest strengths. Their chip design with incredible efficiency, as well as their fantastic camera systems that we find on our iPhones that Apple's already mass producing. And this, unlike a folding phone, is a drastic rethinking of the way we use our devices that would involve more eye tracking and hand tracking than using a touchscreen. A step change, you could call it, off of moving away from the keyboard and mouse days, now moving away from the touchscreen era. This is definitely a moonshot project. There's risks involved. But if you're rethinking and entering a new product space that you feel like needs guidance or needs your expertise in order to go mainstream, then you truly do have the opportunity to launch the next big thing. So when you're kicking off a brand new Apple product category, what do you focus on? Do you want it to be affordable and accessible to the masses? Do you cut a few corners and figure out what you really need to include in that product in order for it to be accessible? Or do you go all out with it? Do you kind of try to prove the product category as a whole and focus more so on the experience rather than the accessibility and the affordability of the product? Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious. We all know what Apple did here, and I think it was pretty smart of them to start off with the terminology. Let's start with the name there, Apple Vision Pro. It's the first generation Apple product that's ever started with the Pro suffix in the name, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think that's by accident. I feel like that's Apple's subtle way of winking at us saying, yes, this is expensive. We know it's high end, and that's probably part of the reason they restricted it to just the United States market. It's still currently not available outside of the US. Hopefully it expands pretty quickly, but Apple wanted to focus on the experience of spatial computing first and foremost. That way they could sell people on the vision of it, no pun intended. Get people comfortable with the idea of, okay, there might be a future where we do a lot of our computing on these headsets instead of just on our tablets, phones, and laptops. In other words, the Apple Vision Pro is basically slightly more accessible than a dev kit. This is kind of a proving ground for Apple to figure out, how do we mass produce such an intricate and complicated object with so many cameras, so many LiDAR sensors and infrared scanners, and And of course, they want to bake in this custom state-of-the-art R1 chip alongside Apple's custom M series chip with the M2. So much new technology all packed into one thing. Maybe it's smart that Apple decided not to make this accessible to the masses and try to mass produce it right off the bat, because it is intricate. It is very complicated, and there's still like moving displays on the inside to calibrate for your eyes and that kind of thing. So much new uncharted territory all being explored at once. While it may seem risky and very different from Apple's traditional product launches, in a lot of ways maybe going more expensive and going more rare and hard to access globally was the more safe route. It allows them to focus more on lower production numbers and just focus on how do we make sure the experience of spatial computing is introduced to people in the most comfortable and impressive way possible. And I think those initial 20 to 30 minutes that anyone spends for their first time wearing Apple Vision Pro are probably the most exciting. It's almost like the product was designed from the ground up for that in-store free demo that you can do. And I know some people were complaining about bloatware and that kind of thing on Vision OS, but I actually think it's great that they included the Encounter Dinosaurs app by default. You don't have to go on the App Store and download that, because it's not a functional app. You know, you're not using it to watch a movie or a TV show, and it's not even really a video game. It's just something you experience. But that initial demo that they came up with, that they decided every single Vision Pro should have, basically shows you what's possible with this technology. It introduces you to the concept of pass-through being pretty good with that butterfly, and the idea that virtual environments can interact and come right up to you, and you can feel like you're almost touching them. It feels like they're really there because you're getting different perspectives from each eye, so there's this true feeling of depth. You encounter this little, hey, what a cute little dinosaur running around, and hey, it feels like this butterfly actually flew right up to my finger, and simultaneously you get excited and you get scared from the much larger dinosaurs coming up to you and kind of jumping out of the screen, tracking with your hands as you move around. It's very much, I think, an idea-based product. It's like, look at what's possible with this technology, but then once you get past that initial demo, once you actually start using it for days and days on end, I've been using mine for the past couple of weeks, and you quickly start to realize, okay, this is definitely a new wave of interacting with our virtual content. There's so much Apple ecosystem friendliness with this. I can read my iMessage texts, I can watch my shows on Apple TV, listen to music from Apple Music, I've got all my iCloud photos I can browse through. So it feels like it integrates so well, more so than probably any other VR or AR product out there, because it's made by Apple and they have so many in-house native advantages like that. But once you start using it for hours and hours on end, and I know a lot of people were asking, how does it feel after wearing it all day? Or do you get sick? Do you get eye fatigue? Does it give you headaches or motion sickness? Or does it feel uncomfortable after a while? And truthfully, no. Despite the high weight and the fact that the headset's not distributed all that well across your head, I never really got to the point where I'm like, oh my god, I'm getting a headache, or oh, my eyes are feeling strained. No, I could wear it for hours and hours, but that's not the reason I wasn't able to exceed about 3 to 4 hours of wearing it at a time. Main reason was I kind of ran out of use cases for it. And I mean, sure, this battery isn't helping, capping you at about 2 hours. Even on the days where I'm near a wall outlet testing that all-day battery life, you quickly realize after playing around with it for a while and using it for a little bit that, okay, I can read my iMessage texts on here, I can check my email on here, I can browse Safari, and I can look at my photos, but does it do any of these things really better than our existing hardware? Does it let me respond to text messages or check my email better than I can on my iPhone? It's definitely a very trippy way to do it, to have just this giant floating tile that you can place anywhere in space and be able to reach out and scroll through it like it's this giant floating iPad. It's an incredible experience to feel that blending of the virtual world with our real world, and yet at the same time, it's like, okay, I gotta type with my pointers out like this, or I've gotta look at each individual key and tap my fingers together, or you gotta use dictation, which is just even more awkward if you're around other people. And at the end of the day, none of these texting methods are really as simple or as intuitive as just using the basic keyboard that you have on your iPhone. And if you're willing to pair it with a Bluetooth keyboard, then you might as well just use a laptop at that point. You're gonna have two different devices to keep charged, and as I've discovered, it's already kind of cumbersome to carry around the Vision Pro and the battery pack. You've got to find a place for this. I didn't think it would be as annoying as it ended up being. At first I thought, oh yeah, okay, what's the big deal? I'll just put the battery in my pocket and then put this on and I'm all good. But when you're using it at a desk, or when you're using it in the back of a car, or when you're traveling around, it starts to really stack up a little bit how often you're like, oh crap, where do I put this battery? Where do I put the case for my AirPods? Oh, where do I put the travel case for the Vision Pro? Oh, and I need my phone around. Sometimes, you know, I gotta access the phone for stuff. And there's so many steps now that I guess wasn't there before. You know, the main reason I was kind of interested in trying Vision Pro and potentially keeping it was because I was saying in the past that I like having a big external monitor with my MacBook, but we're traveling so much, I feel like I wouldn't get access to a studio display or a pro display if I left it on my desk. So I thought, what if there was a way for me to have a big external monitor to pair with my MacBook that I could also take with me, that I could travel with? And kind of was the case with this, and I actually have traveled a lot over the past couple weeks and used this to edit videos off of my MacBook in the car or at friends and family members' houses, and I realized, okay, yes, it's nice to have a big external monitor, but what I didn't anticipate was how many steps it was to not only pack this around with me. Okay, now I've got a phone to keep track of, my AirPods to keep track of, and my MacBook to keep track of, which my phone and my MacBook are so much thinner. They're so much easier to just, you know, slip in my pocket, or I can throw my MacBook in a backpack or a bag. And yes, it is wide, but it's so thin, and it's an aluminum enclosure, so I'm not too worried about how my MacBook is stored in a backpack or in just the trunk of my car. Whereas with this, we've got this giant rounded curved plastic front that is very easy to scratch, honestly, so thank God they include this little cover for it. I've used this a lot whenever I'm traveling around with it, but even then you still have these exposed lenses on the back, and traveling around with it made me realize that unlike an iPad or a MacBook or an iPhone, the sheer girth of the Apple Vision Pro, even if you have a travel case and you're willing to spend the extra $200, or maybe you find a cheaper one on Amazon for $90 or $100, okay, great, still, it's another expense that I wouldn't have had to made for my phone or MacBook. It's still not all that portable. It doesn't slip into a backpack as easily as another Apple product does, and it's not like a pair of headphones where you can easily just slide it down and have it sit around your neck all the time, because now you've got, you know, $3,000 dangling from your neck if you're willing to use the solo knit band, which is a bit less comfortable than the dual loop band. This absolutely takes a lot more pressure off of my cheeks, but let's assume it was really easy to travel around with, and that was not a problem for me, and I was just used to carrying around a bigger backpack. Even so, when I just ended up leaving my Vision Pro on my desk a lot of the time, I would often open up my MacBook, okay, unlock that with Touch ID, and now I want to use the external monitor support with Vision OS. I've got to pick up the Vision Pro, make sure the cable has a convenient way to reach the battery pack, then take off this cover and unlock it via Optic ID, which requires you to look at one very specific part of the display. Then I have to look at the MacBook and wait for that little connect option to pop up, which sometimes it doesn't right away, so I have to go into display settings on the MacBook Pro and hit plus and then hit Apple Vision Pro. And my point is, it doesn't have like onboard memory. It doesn't necessarily always know as soon as I put it on exactly what I want to use it for. And I got to admit, most of the time after using it for about a week, I realized that the external monitor support was, like many others, my favorite feature. That was my go-to feature, using my Mac and treating this as another way to interact with my Mac. Vision OS is very much a proving ground right now. I know it's very early and it's going to take some time for app developers to come up with new apps that really make it functional and more immersive, but at least right now, I mean, you can't even rearrange the apps on your home screen. It's very, very basic, and if apps are not optimized for Vision OS yet, which is most of them, you're getting the iPad version, and we know how devs kind of ignore a lot of the iPad versions of apps compared to the iPhone version, and unfortunately not having a dedicated YouTube app of any kind. And I know there's a third-party one that you could buy, but if you don't plan on using this all that frequently, it's kind of just sending money down the drain. I don't think I would get much use out of that app anyway, but it still is very frustrating that YouTube doesn't have their own designated app, and most people said, oh, well, just use the Safari version. Using websites that are clearly not designed for eye tracking and pinching makes it a lot more difficult to navigate the YouTube UI using Vision OS. I can't even get the player controls to disappear all that much, and you can full screen a window, but it's very hard to scrub around on the playhead, and especially when you're navigating Creator Studio, there's a bunch of little buttons that are optimized for a point-and-click mouse, as well as buttons and options that show up when you hover your mouse over things that don't show up when you're just using your eyes, so there's a bunch of options that are kind of buried whenever you're using this. And it became so frustrating to try to navigate the YouTube user interface using Safari that I discovered it was much, much easier for me to just pair this with my Mac and watch YouTube videos on my Mac using picture-in-picture. Even using one of the most common reasons I wanted an external monitor from my Mac so I could could read the chat when I'm live streaming and editing a video simultaneously, I noticed very quickly that, okay, I'll be looking at my Mac and editing a video on Final Cut, but then whenever I check the chat using Safari on visionOS, it disconnects my mouse from my Mac and thinks, oh, now I want to use mouse support on visionOS. So then there's always this little bit of latency and a little bit of hiccup when I read the chat and then look back at Final Cut. It's like, oh, actually, you want to connect the mouse back to your Mac again? There's this slight hiccup. It's not very long, but it's noticeable, and it definitely wouldn't be there with a real external monitor. And while it is truly immersive, like you can scale it up to have a full 4K resolution as an external monitor, it is still capped at 60 hertz, which is a bit of a bummer, because I know the displays in Vision Pro can technically go up to 100 hertz, and that was part of the reason I was kind of interested in trying this out, was because I felt like the studio display had weaker display specs than my onboard MacBook Pro display, and I thought, well, maybe this is closer because it's micro OLED and it's higher refresh rate, but there's no way to have a physical wired connection, at least for your external monitor support, to Vision Pro from your Mac, and that results in, yes, fairly high resolution, and yes, very low latency for external monitor support, but you take a noticeable dip in frame rate, and it's very noticeable as soon as I stop editing a video with Vision Pro and I go back into Final Cut and I have that buttery smooth 120 hertz refresh rate. I'm like, oh yeah, this is way faster, this is way smoother, even though the display isn't as big virtually. And just all of the steps involved every time I wanted to pair my Vision Pro with my Mac, or oftentimes in the past week I've been traveling and editing videos simultaneously, and I started realizing after a while that having to keep track of this battery and the cover for the EyeSight display so I don't scratch it, it's just too many things to dart around with. You know, it was pretty easy in the past for me to just have one USB-C cable and the charge brick that I can charge my MacBook with and I can charge my iPhone with, and because this only has about a 2-hour battery life, it was constantly making me unplug my MacBook. It was like, hold on, not only do I have to keep my phone and MacBook charged, now I have to keep this charged while I'm traveling around, and it didn't take long for me to kill this battery. Pretty much every single day I could kill it without much hardcore usage, and there were several points where we were kind of rushing and we knew we had to get out the door, but we were heading to a friend's house for dinner, and afterwards I was going to edit a video in the car, and I was making sure I had all the stuff we needed to bring to our friend's house, and my phone and my AirPods and my MacBook, and before I knew it, we were kind of rushing out the door, and I realized, wait, I left the Apple Vision Pro on my desk. Do I want to go run in and grab it so I can edit with an external monitor while I'm editing in the car? And I realized, you know what, this is just too much work, and I left it behind. I had that Woody and Buzz moment from Toy Story 3 where he's like, which one do I take with me? And it wasn't even a week into the ownership experience, and I was already like, you know what, it's just kind of a hassle to keep bringing you along everywhere I go. I'm sorry, so I left it behind. And I wanted to keep on using it. I especially wanted other friends and family members to try it around me, but I do think it very much is all doubling down on the experience. The pass-through cameras are getting very, very close to reality. It's not quite all the way there. You know, you have a bit more blurred vision as your hands get closer to your eyes, and things further away are usually a bit noisier, even in broad daylight. But there's this sweet spot between 3 to 9 feet, I would say, where if you're in a well-lit environment and you're not looking at the edges of the display that much because it's more blurry there and you don't have that great a field of view compared to other headsets like the Quest 3. But in that little sweet spot, when you're looking at the center of your vision at things that are about 3 to 9 feet away, almost perfect. It's almost indiscernible from reality. If I were to look at a scale of like 0% being not immersive at all and 100% being completely immersive and almost identical to reality, I would say the pass-through cameras on the Quest 3 are probably around 30% of the way there. Like, yes, it's a bit more realistic than a Quest 2, but clearly no one's going to look at the pass-through on the Quest 3 and think it's close to reality. But Apple Vision Pro, I would say, is almost like double that. It's like 60% of the way there, and there's absolutely a lot of Apple advantages that we all know about with their custom silicon being super efficient, their state-of-the-art camera systems, their superior performance in video playback, all of their real-world data when it comes to ARKit and LiDAR, and all of the machine learning they've developed from iPhone photography and videography. All of these things are going to translate into some very, very captivating and fascinating follow-up generations. That's honestly the far more exciting part about visionOS and Apple Vision Pro, is where it's going, not so much where it is right now. And knowing that Apple probably with every generation of Apple Vision is going to get closer and closer to that 100% mark where it's basically indiscernible from a pair of glasses or just looking looking at reality with your own eyes. That by far makes the Apple Vision Pro, in my opinion, despite not being worth it and the battery life being so limited and the app support not being very good, it's still, hands down, the most interesting Apple product right now, because everything else has already been there. We've already seen refinement and iteration upon iteration of iPads and iPhones and Macs. Even the Apple Watch is quickly running out of new features to come up with, to the point now where they're software locking things on the new watches. And kind of the same story with AirPods. How good can you get noise cancellation? How good can you get transparency mode? It's already pretty freaking amazing, and now we're just in the refinement era, but instead of just getting a slightly faster chip or a slightly longer battery life like we do on our iPhones and Macs, with improvements in smaller nanometer architectures for Apple Silicon, better power efficiency, and better camera performance, instead of just getting 5% better photos 5% of the time, there's now serious and objective advantages that are going to come to headsets like this, gaining those types of camera advances, gaining those types of Apple Silicon advances. You know, an Apple M5 chip in a MacBook Pro, it's not really going to change the way you use your MacBook all that much, okay? The battery life gets a little bit better, and your export time goes down from 4 minutes to 3 minutes. Yay, I'm so excited. But with those kinds of efficiency gains and performance gains in a headset like this, we're talking about superior battery life. That means you can use it for longer stretches at a time. We're talking about more performance power that developers can take advantage of for more augmented experiences, whether that be gaming or workflow examples, or having multiple external monitors that you can pair with your computer, with better Wi-Fi connectivity in the future, which right now doesn't make a big impact on how you use your Mac, whether or not it has Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 7. It's like, yeah, whatever. But newer chips and newer silicon like that can make a big difference on this type of device. And of course, all of those camera improvements that aren't that noticeable when you're just taking pictures and videos on our phones, they make a huge difference when it comes to the pass-through performance. They can make it more immersive, and hopefully with the mass production of a lot of these chips and a lot of these cameras that Apple's buying up for iPhones and iPads anyway, they'll be able to lower the price as they iron out the kinks in the assembly line, figure out how to mass produce these at scale with reliable consistency. And of course, it's going to take a lot of time for the software to be a little bit less isolating. I understand that before I got the headset, I was telling people, oh no, this is not isolating, at least not any more than a pair of headphones. I mean, yes, only one person can wear it at a time, but tech is really only as isolating as you make it. That was my narrative before, but now that I've been using this for a while, I kind of see what people are saying about isolation. It's one thing to just be able to hear what others can't hear, but it's another to just be able to see what others can't see. And I gotta admit, one of the best use cases for the headset that is the most fun and most immersive experience is just watching movies and TV shows. Apple put a lot of time and attention into these little details, like where you sit in the movie theater and how the movie reflects on the floor. Especially if you try to watch a movie or a TV show on Mount Hood's environment, you get the little reflection of the movie over the lake. It's super cool. Audio pods sound fantastic, and it really does feel like you have this giant screen you're looking at in front of you. But here's the problem. When I'm watching movies and TV shows, I'm almost always watching them with another person. I hardly ever just watch a full-length movie or a TV show by myself. I'm married, and I enjoy watching those kinds of shows with my wife. And currently, despite my Vision OS wish lists, there's still no way, even if I try to AirPlay the show to the TV, my wife's just gonna see like my perspective from the headset. It's not gonna be the same immersive experience as it would be if she could watch the movie on the TV, and then I could have an adjustable window of that same movie that's synced up so we could pause it or play it, or one of us could have subtitles and one of us couldn't. That's very, very high on my list of Vision OS 2.0, which I know a lot of people don't think is that big a deal. Like, okay, whatever, SharePlay doesn't sound that crazy, but I do genuinely think I could use this a heck of a lot more if other people could be like on board with the experience with me. But currently, Vision OS doesn't let me do that type of thing. So if we want to watch a movie or a show, it's like, sorry, okay, let me take this off, put it in the other room. Maybe if I lived alone, maybe if I was single and a bachelor, I would be able to justify this a bit more. And I know some of you are just saying, well, just everybody leave their wives so they can justify this $4,000 expense. Sorry, no, I'm gonna choose the wife every time before this. But there are software solutions out there, and that's why it's so exciting to talk about our wish lists and what could be added in future generations that's not there right now. So many great ideas and concepts that I've already seen developers pitching around, and I do think Apple nails the software experience so much better than any other VR headset out there, figuring out this middle ground between augmented and virtual environments. And honestly, I've really loved using the environments feature to just just kind of cover what's ever behind my Mac display. So I can still see my MacBook keyboard and trackpad and interact with all that, but also have a much more sharp environment to look at behind the monitor, because of course the environments on here are far more realistic looking and far higher resolution than the pass-through cameras are, which depending on the lighting in your environment, the pass-through can be okay or not that great. I've also run into a lot of situations where the cameras are constantly saying, move back, you're too close to a wall. And I guess I just live in a small house because I don't feel like I'm that close to the wall. Or if I'm editing a video in the car, then it's constantly freaking out about the windows and it's worried I'm gonna bonk my head against something. I never have, by the way, but it's constantly telling me to back up, get some more space. And this is the first Apple product I realized that can be fundamentally limited if you're just in a low light environment. Like the user interface starts to not work all that well, where it's not able to see your hands and you're not able to control it that accurately if you're in too dark of an environment. And a lot of us watch movies and TV shows at night in maybe the not most well-lit environments, so that can actually come up and be kind of annoying compared to our iPhones with incredibly bright and dim displays, as well as our MacBooks with their backlit keys. It's never really been a problem until I started using this. I realized, hey, I actually use my computers a lot in fairly low light environments, and this is constantly bugging me about it. But again, room for improvement with future camera upgrades, future camera iterations that will be able to see better in lower light environments. It's kind of a different ballgame because these cameras are being focused a lot more on lifetime views of our environments at higher refresh rates, which is not the same use as our cameras in our smartphones, because those are mainly giving you fairly low frame rates for picture taking and video recording, and there's a lot of post-processing that can go on with our iPhones. Compared to this, everything has to be processed in real time. So it's a little bit of a different ballgame. There is certainly some translation between how cameras are interpreting their environments and all that kind of thing, but I actually think Tim Cook is making the right call between all the different moonshot projects he was thinking of taking Apple in. We know there's been talk for foldables for a long time, and there's been talk of Apple developing a car for a long time. And yes, Tim Cook had to look at Apple's assets and look at, okay, what are we good at? What can we bring to the table that kind of separates us from everybody else? And I think spatial computing is different enough from the smartphone, unlike foldables, which is kind of just a redo of tablets and smartphones in a slightly different form factor that's going to be mostly reliant on what kind of displays they can get from Samsung, or of course the car, where they're very behind the game compared to all the other EV companies that are already in production. And it's a very difficult profitability game that Apple's probably not going to want to play because they're always about outsourcing manufacturing. So they realized that probably this spatial computing era was something they had a lot of advantages in, a lot of unique approaches that no one else would really be able to touch because of their custom silicon and their great software expertise, as well as eye tracking technology, their experience with audio performance with these speakers, and they've got the most power efficient silicon in the game, which is kind of everything you need in order for this to get mainstream. You need it lighter, you need it cheaper, you need high performance per watt, as well as a state-of-the-art software and user interface team. So this is the right direction, I think, for Apple to go in, and it's a little bit scary to imagine what our world is going to look like if this does start replacing a lot of our tech. I don't think it'll ever replace the phone, just because the phones are always going to be cheaper, longer battery life, easier to use, and of course camera features that you just can't replicate with this. But in regards of how you use a tablet, you know, I could see drawing on infinite sized canvas with an eventual Apple Pencil update that you could pair to this, as well as using it more and more as external monitors for our Mac with better refresh rates and hopefully better memory in the future. So as soon as I put it on, it just instantly knows that I want to use it with my Mac, and boom, the external monitor's already there. Optic ID can get a little faster and a little bit better integrated. And spatial videos as well, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. Right now, it's really only immersive if you're recording things that are 3 to 6 feet away from you. If you're trying to record a big landscape, you're not really going to detect much depth, and spatial videos right now are still limited to about 1080p at 30 frames a second, which is not that immersive. It's not that high of a resolution when you have a 4K TV for each eyeball. And honestly, if you're filming landscapes, I found just recording a 4K at 60 video with the ultra-wide camera on my iPhone 15 was probably more immersive, even though it was a 2D video on this thing, just because it covered much more of my vision and the frame rate was much closer to lifelike performance. So, you know, spatial photos and videos is pretty much the only thing that is exclusive to this. You can't really experience those on your phone or your laptop. You can watch them on your Quest 3 though, ironically. So at $3,500, it's really just trying to show people what spatial computing could be one day. There's a lot of imagine what this will be like in the future. It requires a lot of imagination, which is why it's so hard to justify this insanely high price. My go-to use case for it was not really traveling with it because it's so bulky and because the battery life isn't too long. I found that after just a couple weeks of usage, I mainly wanted to use it at my desk as an external monitor. But if I'm only using it as an external monitor at my desk, it's going to be way cheaper and way easier to just buy an external monitor that's going to be way brighter and way higher resolution than this would feel. And I also don't have to worry about an external monitor influencing my hair. Or there were many times where I would wear the headset for 3 to 4 hours and then come out of my office and my wife would be like, oh my gosh, your face looks so red, leaves all these impressions here. And that's with the dual loop band. That's with me adjusting the size as much as I can and trying to make it as comfortable as possible. I didn't feel uncomfortable, but my face looked pretty obviously like I've been wearing, you know, a pretty big headset for a few hours. So that gets old for a while, and it wouldn't be a problem if I just went out and bought a studio display, or any external monitor really would get the job done and not require me to unlock 2 separate devices, one with my fingerprint and one with my irises. And because I see so many people still using this by themselves, like, don't believe any of those videos of people walking around with Vision Pro all the time, acting like they're using it. Right now, I know for a fact all the people doing that are basically just using pass-through, wearing it like you would a pair of sunglasses, because you can't really track windows or applications to follow around with you. So when you're walking around like that, you walk right past the home screen. You walk past all those apps, and you probably get the headset yelling at you, say, hey, be aware of your surroundings, and that kind of thing. All of those crazy videos that people are doing just to bring attention to themselves, they're not actually using the headset, basically just the pass-through, which is just a slightly more fuzzy, more uncomfortable, more inefficient way to look at your surroundings. But it's definitely not as convenient as just pulling out your phone and taking a picture or sending a text just through a little rectangle in your pocket. I don't think that's being threatened anytime soon, but this, with a few more iterations and a few more software updates, I do see kind of getting close to replacing TVs, tablets, maybe laptops to a certain extent, or at least change the laptop you buy. Maybe if you're using this as your virtual display all the time, you won't feel the need to buy the 16-inch MacBook anymore. Might as well just buy the smallest one you can, because you can have an infinitely sized external monitor with this thing attached anyway. So the laptop just becomes your keyboard and your trackpad, and also your speaker system, by the way. When you're using your Mac with this on, there's no way to route the macOS audio to these speakers, so you either have to use AirPods or the MacBook onboard speakers, which, I don't know, just kind of kills some of the immersion a little bit. Typing is definitely going to be a tricky thing to replicate, and it is a very common experience that we're used to on our tablets, phones, and laptops. And I'm sorry, typing with my pointers or with dictation or with looking at the keys, yeah, that's just never going to be as quick. It doesn't matter how good your muscle memory is. There's also just a weirdum when you have to look at the delete key and tap like this, and you don't know how many characters you've actually deleted yet. It's like, becomes abundantly clear how often you're controlling things without looking at them on your other devices once you start using this, because it absolutely does take some getting used to be like, okay, I'm switching from photo mode to video mode. You have to control everything with how you're looking at the screen, which is just not the same way we use our other tech products, especially with like iPhones and iPads. There's so many gestures we use, and gesture is the epitome of controlling a device without looking at it. You know, you just swipe up on your home screen and you know what that does on your iPhone. You don't have to look at the bottom of your screen. Whereas with this, you have to be very intentional about, okay, I'm looking here, I'm looking here, I'm looking here now. Some of this just takes some getting used to, and some of it is just inherently worse and not as good as it is on other products. So it's going to take some time for Apple to figure out, okay, what is this genuinely good at? And let's lean into those advantages. That's why I don't think the eyesight display is going to last. It's cool for marketing and brand recognition because no other VR headset has that eyesight display, but I don't think people look at it and go, wow, it's like I'm really looking at your eyes. Everyone in my family who I showed this to was always like, ugh, that's freaky. That's kind of weird. And it's very expensive, and it's hard to even see in most lighting environments, so I think they're just going to scrap it to save money in the future. I do think it looks really cool, though. Just that glossy black curved front, that's hard to compete with, so I do hope they keep that. It could just be a glossy jet black plastic they put on the front. Helps all of the cameras and LiDAR sensors blend in so they're not as obvious as they are on headsets like the Quest 3. So if you're asking if it's worth the $3,500 and I'm keeping it, sorry, no. The only thing that would make me feel worse than spending $3,500 on this is knowing that if I keep it and it's just sitting at home collecting dust most of the time, then I spent $3,500 on a paperweight that I only occasionally use as an external monitor. That would be a colossal waste, so I will not be be keeping it. However, I do think it's still a lot of fun, and there's still a lot of impressive tech that they've built into this that truly cannot be articulated well over a 2D YouTube video or a 3D YouTube video, let's be honest. So I highly recommend everybody try one out. Next time you're in the city or closer to an Apple store, book a demo, because it really is fun and it really gets your gears turning on what the future possibilities of this technology are. Very much like every other first generation Apple product that went out to kind of lay the groundwork, it's laying the foundation to build something truly great that does go mainstream. Original iPhone did not have an app store, didn't have a front-facing camera, couldn't change your wallpaper, didn't even have basic multitasking, it didn't even have 3G, which was a very common thing on other smartphones at that time. So a lot of people were rightfully skeptical of the first iPhone, going, I don't see how this is going anywhere. Very expensive multi-touch display that basically just makes phone calls, takes a couple of pictures, but that's really it. It was only until a few generations in that people started realizing, okay, having an app store, having multitasking, and a front-facing camera allows for selfies, FaceTime, infinite possibilities with all of those different apps that people came up with. You had the whole there's an app for that marketing campaign. A lot of people would agree it was kind of around the iPhone 4 era that the iPhone really found its mainstream stride, and lots of people started justifying the additional expense for it. And I think we might be looking at a fairly similar product roadmap with this, where after 3 or 4 iterations and improvements is when it starts getting affordable and practical, and you could actually start wearing it more passively throughout the day. The app market will grow a lot for it, and there's probably use cases for this that we haven't even thought of yet that Apple's way ahead of us on. But this is just laying the groundwork, getting us prepared for what's to come so that we're comfortable with the idea. And again, there's lots of developers that can now access this, write apps for it, so that when that inevitable mass market, globally shipped, cheaper headset comes out, there's going to be a very rich and vibrant app store full of games and experiences that everybody's ready to try. And a lot more people can be comfortable with the idea of eye tracking and pinching because they've had some rough experience with it. And because it's a product that's all about the experience and all about convincing people what spatial computing can do, it's absolutely worth the demo. I highly encourage everybody to try it out. But yes, of course, it's not worth the $3,500. Very difficult for me to find anybody in my personal life that I would say, yeah, you know what? I think this is actually worth the expense. Maybe if you're a millionaire and you've got that kind of money lying around, but I ain't. And honestly, if you saw how much money the channel was generating this month, you too would agree this is not a good idea. But it's also going to be very difficult for me to go back to talking about anything else at Apple now, because this, in my opinion, is by far the most interesting thing they got going on. The sky's the limit with Vision OS use cases and hardware improvements they could make in future generations. I've made tons of videos about that, and I'll probably make more, even though I'm not keeping this around, which is why I encourage you to ask more questions about it, or say why you don't think this will take off, or explain why you think it'll be a big fad. And I hope this conversation can be ongoing and Apple can listen to us and hear us, and we can see how wrong or right we are in the long term. It's a very exciting time for Apple right now, just because they finally are entering kind of new territory, and they seem fairly passionate about continuing it and improving on it. And I can't wait to see what kind of step change improvements and very large objective upgrades come in the future. And thanks again to everybody supporting this channel directly. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you all in the next one.